Courtroom woke slowly as morning light passed through tall windows and settled on wooden benches and quiet faces. People filled the room with low breaths and small movements while waiting for the judge to arrive. At the back of the room stood a royal guard named Leo, calm and steady, wearing a clean uniform that showed years of discipline. He had been called to court as a witness for a case that seemed small on paper but heavy in tension. Leo stood still with his hands behind his back and his eyes forward, showing respect to the place and the process. Leo had served for many years guarding important buildings and people, and he understood how power often spoke louder than truth. He knew courtrooms were not just places of law but also stages where pride and control were tested. As he waited, he noticed how some people looked at his uniform with curiosity while others looked with quiet judgment. None of that mattered to him because he believed that behavior spoke louder than clothing. He focused on his breathing and stayed ready for whatever questions might come. The sound of the door opening made everyone stand at once. Judge Harris entered with slow steps and a face that carried confidence mixed with boredom. He took his seat and looked across the room as if measuring everyone in silence. When his eyes reached Leo, they paused longer than expected. A faint smile crossed the judge's face, not warm but sharp. The judge began the hearing in a formal tone, speaking about order and respect. His voice echoed slightly as he called the first names and reviewed basic details. When it was time for Leo to step forward, the judge leaned back in his chair and watched closely. Leo walked forward with controlled steps and stopped where instructed. He stood straight and waited without shifting his weight. Judge Harris looked at the uniform again and raised an eyebrow. He made a comment about how such uniforms belonged in old stories rather than modern courts. A few people shifted in their seats as the room grew uneasy. Leo did not respond because he had not been asked a question. He remained quiet and respectful, knowing when silence was the strongest response. The judge continued speaking, now directing his words more personally toward Leo. He suggested that guards were trained to follow orders without understanding the meaning behind them. The words were sharp but spoken with a smooth voice. Leo answered only when asked, keeping his replies short and clear. He used simple words and steady tone, showing no sign of anger or fear. Some of the lawyers glanced at one another, sensing the change in the room. This was no longer just a normal hearing but something more uncomfortable. The judge seemed to enjoy pushing the limits of respect. Each remark felt like a test meant to provoke a reaction. Leo refused to give one. Leo remembered his training, which focused not only on strength but on restraint. He had learned that patience could protect more than force ever could. He also knew that every official action left a record. Every word spoken in court mattered more than people realized. That knowledge kept him grounded as the judge spoke again. Judge Harris asked questions that drifted away from the actual case. He questioned Leo's background and suggested his role was simple and replaceable. The tone carried a quiet insult wrapped in authority. The courtroom air felt heavy as people listened without speaking. Leo answered carefully, choosing truth over emotion every time. What the judge did not realize was that Leo understood the law deeply. His role required him to work closely with legal systems and protocols. He knew which words crossed lines and which actions carried consequences. As the judge spoke, Leo listened closely, not just to the meaning but to the intent. Each sentence was stored in his mind with clarity. The judge finally waved his hand as if finished with the guard. He made one last remark that drew a few uncomfortable coughs from the room. Leo paused for a brief moment before turning away. That pause was not defiance but decision. He knew the moment would matter later. As Leo walked back to his place, the judge moved on as if nothing unusual had happened. The hearing continued, but the tension did not fade. Leo stood quietly, his face calm, his thoughts focused. He understood that power often revealed itself through misuse. He also understood that systems could correct themselves when guided properly. Outside the courtroom walls, the building remained quiet and unaware of what had begun inside. Leo knew that respect was not demanded but proven. He believed that the truth had a way of surfacing when patience was applied. What looked like a small insult was actually a clear signal. The story was just beginning, and the balance had already started to shift. The courtroom slowly emptied as the session paused and people whispered among themselves. Leo remained where he stood, calm and steady, watching the movement without reacting. He understood that moments like this often decided the future more than loud arguments. His face showed no emotion, but his mind was active and alert. He knew exactly what he needed to do next. As people left the room, Leo noticed how Judge Harris spoke casually with a few officials. The judge laughed softly, clearly confident that his words carried no risk. Power had made him careless, and carelessness often left marks. Leo did not look at the judge again because he already had what he needed. He focused instead on the process that followed after court sessions. Outside the courtroom, the hallway echoed with footsteps and low voices. Leo walked slowly toward a quiet corner where official notices were posted. He stood there for a moment as if reading but was actually listening. Every sound and movement added to his understanding of the place. He believed that awareness was a form of protection. Leo carried a small notebook, not for writing but for reminding himself to stay focused. He did not need to write anything because his memory was trained and precise. He recalled the judge's words clearly and exactly as spoken. He knew how official conduct was measured and reviewed. The system had rules even for those who believed they stood above them. Later that day, Leo visited an administrative office within the same building. The office was quiet, with clean desks and serious faces behind glass windows. He waited his turn patiently, showing the same respect he always carried. When called forward, he spoke calmly and clearly. He asked about the proper process for reporting inappropriate conduct during a hearing. The clerk looked at him with mild surprise but answered professionally. She explained that all court proceedings were recorded and reviewed when required. She mentioned that witnesses and officials were protected under certain rules. Her voice remained neutral, but her eyes showed understanding. Leo thanked her and stepped aside without further discussion. As the hours passed, Leo returned to his duties outside the building. He stood at his post, watching people enter and exit, maintaining order. To anyone passing by, he looked like a guard doing a normal shift. No one suspected that the events of the morning were already moving forward. Leo preferred it that way. Judge Harris, meanwhile, left the building with confidence untouched. He believed the courtroom belonged to him and that his position protected his words. He spoke freely with colleagues and joked about the morning session. There was no sign of concern in his behavior. That confidence blinded him to the systems working quietly around him. Days passed, and the court continued its routine. Leo returned for another scheduled appearance as part of his duty. This time, the atmosphere felt different even before the judge arrived. There was a subtle tension in the air that could not be explained easily. Leo noticed it and remained silent. When Judge Harris entered, his steps were the same, but his expression was not. He glanced briefly toward Leo and then looked away. The confidence from before seemed slightly reduced. He adjusted his robe and cleared his throat before speaking. The room listened carefully. The judge spoke more formally this time, sticking closely to procedure. There were no personal remarks and no unnecessary comments. The hearing moved smoothly, almost too carefully. Leo answered when asked and remained quiet otherwise. He knew this change did not happen by accident. After the session ended, a quiet discussion took place near the bench. Officials exchanged documents and spoke in low voices. Judge Harris listened more than he spoke. His face showed controlled concern rather than confidence. Leo observed without staring. Later that evening, Leo was called to a private office within the building. The room was small, clean, and serious in tone. An official explained that a review had been initiated based on the previous hearing. No names were mentioned directly, but the meaning was clear. Leo nodded and listened without adding anything unnecessary. He left the office knowing the process had begun properly. There was no satisfaction on his face, only calm acceptance. He believed that justice worked best when allowed to move naturally. The judge's earlier words now existed beyond memory and emotion. They were part of a record. Judge Harris spent the night restless, sensing the shift he could not control. For the first time in years, he questioned whether his position was enough. Power felt heavier when watched. The system he trusted to protect him now felt distant. And somewhere within the same walls, Leo stood quietly, patient as ever, knowing the truth was already moving forward. The next morning began quietly but carried a strange weight inside the courthouse. Staff members moved with purpose, but their voices were lower than usual. Leo arrived early and took his position near the entrance as always. He noticed unfamiliar officials entering the building with folders in their hands. Their presence signaled that something important was unfolding. Leo remained focused on his duty, greeting people politely and observing calmly. He had learned that change often arrived without noise. While standing still, he watched how conversations stopped when certain people walked past. Eyes followed the officials without drawing attention. The building itself seemed to hold its breath. Judge Harris arrived later than usual that day. His steps were slower, and his face showed signs of tiredness. He avoided long eye contact with anyone and went straight to his chambers. Inside his office, papers were spread across the desk. The confidence he once carried felt distant now. As court sessions began, an announcement was made about a temporary review meeting. The room reacted with quiet surprise and silent curiosity. Judge Harris listened carefully, saying nothing. The tone of authority had shifted from personal control to structured process. Leo stood nearby, listening without expression. During the break, officials entered the judge's chambers one by one. Their faces were serious, and their movements were precise. Documents were placed on the desk and reviewed carefully. Judge Harris sat quietly, hands folded, listening more than speaking. Each word spoken felt measured and heavy. Leo was later requested to be present in a separate room. The room was plain, with a table and a few chairs. An official explained that formal questions would be asked regarding courtroom conduct. Leo answered clearly, sticking only to facts. He spoke without emotion and without accusation. The officials listened closely and took notes. They asked about timing, tone, and sequence of events. Leo responded with accuracy and calm. There was no need to exaggerate or explain further. Truth was enough. While this process continued, Judge Harris waited alone. He replayed the earlier hearing in his mind repeatedly. Words he once considered harmless now felt heavy. He realized how quickly authority could shift when exposed to review. The silence around him felt louder than any argument. Outside, the courthouse remained active, but its energy had changed. Whispers replaced casual talk. People sensed accountability moving through the halls. Leo returned to his post and resumed his duties quietly. He never looked toward the judge's office. Later that afternoon, a formal notice was delivered. It was handed directly to Judge Harris by an official. The message was brief but firm. A temporary restriction was placed while the review continued. The words were clear and official. Judge Harris read the notice slowly. His hands trembled slightly as he placed it down. He understood what it meant without needing explanation. The system he once controlled was now addressing him. That realization changed everything. As the day moved forward, court sessions were adjusted. Another judge was assigned to handle immediate matters. Judge Harris remained in his office, waiting. No arguments were made and no resistance shown. The process moved forward as designed. Leo observed all of this from a distance. He felt no pride or relief. He believed that accountability was not personal. It was necessary. He remained calm and professional as always. By evening, official vehicles arrived quietly at the courthouse. Their presence did not draw attention but carried clear meaning. Officials entered with documents and clear instructions. Judge Harris was informed of the next steps. His expression showed acceptance mixed with disbelief. There was no scene and no raised voices. Everything happened with order and structure. The system worked as it was meant to. Judge Harris followed instructions without resistance. The power dynamic had fully shifted. As the courthouse lights dimmed, Leo stood at his post one last time for the day. He watched as officials escorted Judge Harris through a side exit. The moment was quiet and controlled. No one spoke unnecessary words. The building returned to silence. Leo took a slow breath and remained where he stood. He understood that patience and discipline had guided everything. The insult that started it all now felt distant. What mattered was that respect had been restored through proper means. And as night settled over the courthouse, the truth stood quietly in place, waiting for the final outcome. The final day arrived with a calm that felt deeper than before inside the courthouse. Morning light filled the halls, but the tension that once lived there was gone. Staff members moved with steady focus, knowing a chapter was closing. Leo arrived early as always and took his place near the entrance. His posture remained straight and respectful, unchanged by everything that had happened. The building felt different now, as if balance had been restored quietly. People spoke more carefully and listened more closely. Rules felt present again, not as pressure but as guidance. Leo noticed how order returned without celebration. He believed this was how real justice always looked. Later that morning, officials gathered in a formal room. Documents were reviewed and decisions were finalized. Everything followed clear steps and clear language. There was no rush and no emotion driving the process. Only structure and responsibility guided the moment. Judge Harris was brought in calmly and respectfully. His expression was quiet and serious. The confidence he once showed was replaced by reflection. He listened as findings were explained clearly. Each word landed with weight but without cruelty. The review concluded with firm outcomes based on conduct and record. The decision was delivered in a controlled and professional manner. Judge Harris accepted the result without argument. He understood that authority required accountability. The system had spoken through its rules. Outside the room, Leo waited without expectation. He had not asked for recognition and did not want it. His role had been to follow duty and truth. That role was now complete. He remained still and focused. As officials exited the room, the atmosphere felt lighter. The process had reached its end properly. No one raised voices or expressed satisfaction. Justice did not need applause. It needed consistency. Leo returned to his post as the courthouse resumed normal flow. People entered and exited, unaware of the full story behind the calm. Life moved forward as it always did. The building returned to routine. But something important had changed within its walls. Later that day, Leo was quietly thanked by an official. The words were simple and professional. Leo nodded and returned to his duty. He did not see himself as part of a victory. He saw himself as part of a process. Judge Harris left the courthouse that evening under supervision. There was no crowd and no noise. The moment passed without drama. It marked an ending built on accountability. The law remained larger than any single person. As the sun set, Leo stood at the entrance watching the light fade. He reflected on how patience had guided everything. Anger had not been needed. Respect for the system had been enough. Truth had done its work quietly. In the days that followed, the courthouse continued its work smoothly. New routines formed naturally. People felt safer and more confident in the process. Leo continued his service with the same calm presence. Nothing about his behavior changed. He believed that real strength came from restraint. He believed that dignity was shown through action, not reaction. The insult that once filled the courtroom now had no power. It had been answered the right way, through patience and procedure. Leo remained a guard, steady and unseen by many. But his presence carried meaning. He represented discipline and trust in the system. Not through force but through principle. That was his true duty. As time passed, the story faded from daily conversation. But its lesson remained within the walls. Authority required respect and care. Words spoken in power carried responsibility. And silence guided by truth could reshape outcomes. Leo stood quietly as another day ended. The courthouse lights dimmed again. Order remained where chaos once tried to rise. Justice stood firm without noise. And the story closed not with drama but with balance restored.